All right, back to Ecclesiastes, and as with the Song of Songs, there has been no shortage of discussion as far as this book. It is a wisdom book, and as we have seen already with Job and Proverbs, by the very nature, wisdom books force you to think. They are not easy books to read and to gain the understanding. You have to work at it. Ecclesiastes, like Job and Proverbs, is not the kind of a book that you can read through twice, assign your chapter titles, and go through and find themes and purpose and say, aha, that's it. I'll never have to worry about that book again because I got it down. No, hopefully these books have really gotten under your skin as the Spirit designed them to say, I'm going to have to keep working at this and realize that as you do, the Spirit will work through His Word and start to give you the perspective of wisdom that you need to live in this fallen world, just as they were given for the godly in Israel as they awaited the kingdom. And you are the godly out of Israel today, awaiting the kingdom. And so these books certainly penetrate into our minds and give us an understanding of God's demands and His insight for people as we live upon this fallen earth. But two things as far as Ecclesiastes, and again with these wisdom books, it's not so much that we delve into individual passages and really trying to just come to an appreciation and understanding as far as the whole book is concerned. And so the two interpretive issues that we have time to spend on Ecclesiastes, again, are these big issues. Number one, who wrote it? And number two, why? Well, who wrote it? Well, as you come to the book, obviously we've already seen the book from 1-2 all the way through, chapter 12, verse 8, gives to us the words of the preacher, the words of the wise man as he gathered an assembly together and proclaimed the wisdom that he had been given. And we believe the epilogue is accurate, a wisdom that came from God. And yet it is, as we've already seen, enveloped in the third person by the statements of what many have taken to be either an editor or secondary author to the preacher's message. Now, the position that was held both within Judaism and within Christianity until the Enlightenment was the preacher was Solomon, and Solomon is also the wise man who gives the introduction and the conclusion. And in fact, the conclusion is very, very important because it tells us, in the end, what the preacher was driving at. The preacher, verse 10 of chapter 12, sought to find delightful words and write words of truth correctly. He worked hard to make sure that his thinking was spoken in such a way that it would be both delightful and meaningful, the actual truth, to not only the assembly that heard it first, but also those who will hear it through this book. And the preacher was a wise man. And his words are like goads, kind of like that which was used to prod the oxen to go the right way. Well, we're a bunch of oxes here this morning. And we need to be prodded. We need to be goaded into the right way that God's wisdom would direct us. And so these words are like those goads. They just keep hitting you and moving you along the right path. And masters of the collections are like well-driven nails. You're straight and useful. The most unuseful thing in the world is a crooked nail. Right? You need straight nails, and that's what the masters of these words of the preacher will become. I mean, this is quite an inducement to why you should apply yourself to the words of the preacher. And they're given by one shepherd, the shepherd of Israel. And I would go along with the New American Standard that shepherd there should be capitalized. That the concept that is here is the shepherd. Here is the guide of Israel. Yahweh himself, who through the words of the preacher has given you the wisdom to guide you in your life as you live here upon this fallen world. And then every seminarian's favorite verse, Ecclesiastes 12:12. But beyond this, beyond these words, my son, be warned, the writing of many books is endless. Right? There's all kinds of other self-help books out there. All right? And within this context, what is being said is there is all kinds of wisdom. And we know there were wise men throughout the ancient Near East. And in the readings book, you can read these other wise men of Egypt and Mesopotamia. And they came up with their books. They came up with their, help. Just like today, you can go down to Barnes and Noble and, they got rows and rows and rows of self-help books on every topic you want. Even if you're a dummy. There's a dummy's guide to everything today. All right? Of the making of books, there is no end. And be warned. The books are endless, and excessive devotion is wearying to the body. Amen? Amen. Book after book after book, and it just gets weary. I know that one student heard me one time as I was in the book shack say, "Oh no, another commentary." And so I thought, you like commentaries? I said, Bible expositors, Dr. Roskop and I, we have to sit down and here's another commentary to go through and say, but they just come at you. And it's like I've been encouraged. When's your first commentary going to come out? Well, forget it. There's too many out there already. I have nothing else to say. The real book you need to read is right here. Always amazes me that, you can have, Philemon, 25 verses, and have a commentary of 500 pages on 25 verses. Just read the text. You should say a hearty amen to that too. Forget the long comments. Just read the text. Paul said everything he wanted to say in 25 verses. And, Germans in particular can't say it in less than 500 pages. What he said in 25 verses. Well, beyond that, what he's saying is look, you don't need all this other wisdom literature. Here it is. Master this text, and you will have everything you need to live life wisely, skillfully on this fallen earth. And just in case you missed it, and what you should do is you should go back and read the preacher's message from 1:2 through 12:8 and read it and read it and read it until you come to the same conclusion. That when all is heard, when you've read the whole thing that the preacher said, this is what you should have found out. Fear God and keep his commandments. Because this is to every person Because God will bring every act to judgment, everything which is hidden, whether good or evil. And of course, when is that act of judgment going to take place? What is one of the great themes of Ecclesiastes? After you die. Every person is going to face death. And after death, you face God. All right, so, you can try to penetrate into what is taking place in the world. You won't. Because God has hidden the key in this. So therefore, since God has hidden the key, the earth is subjected to futility. All is vapor-like, including yourself, because of that. All right, who should you fear? Who should you be in awe of? Who's got the key? God. So learn to live your life not being your own God, but submitting to the God who has made you. And when all is said and done, that God has given commandments. And so interestingly, the preacher points not only to what he has said within his message, but also points you back to Torah. He is a true wise man at this point, realizing that the wisdom that he has discovered, that God has given to him through his discoveries, is right in line with what has been revealed in Torah. Now, who is saying this? Well, as I said, traditionally it is Solomon. And there is no problem with the preacher himself giving the introduction and the conclusion in the third person. And as you can see, Kaiser and Glenn in the Bible Knowledge Commentary take that traditional perspective. But as you can see, that is not anymore the major interpretation within evangelicalism. So you've got who is basically the preacher, who is the writer of the prologue and the epilogue. Eaton takes the position that the preacher is Solomon, but that the writer of the introduction and conclusion is an editor of Solomon. Just make sure you've picked up what Solomon had to say. Here is the author. But then we can get into some real interesting perspectives. And as you read the book, many times, particularly as liberals have read the book, they say, well, the preacher is, he's not just one voice. Because you got places of real negativism, real pessimism, almost skepticism within the preacher, and at other times he becomes very, very positive. You can see that the first two chapters. I mean, we got the negative preacher till about halfway through chapter 2, the one who, set his mind to no wisdom, set himself to no pleasure, and in the end, his conclusion is it's all vapor-like. It's all futility. It's all vanity. But then he comes, but there is a positive thing. Well, life is from a gift from God, and so you should enjoy life and rejoice in your labors. And so what they do is they set within the message of the preacher, we might put it this way, there is the positive message and the negative message. And of course, the positive and the negative in their mind could not have come from the same person. I mean, once you're dealing with that, you're dealing with two authors. You got the negative wise man and the positive wise man. And of course, the final wise man who wrote the introduction and conclusion couldn't figure it out, so he just left it there and just kind of counterpoints. And as the final editor said, well, here it is. Here's the preacher. Take it for what it is. Oh, by the way, my conclusion is fear God and keep his commandments, because in the end, that's what I think you should do. But in the end, listen to the preacher, and you can figure out whether to be a skeptic or whether to have at least a certain amount of positive faith toward God. So the three wise men approach, this is not a Christmas story, the three wise men approach was very, very popular within liberalism into the beginning of the 20th century. Even most liberals have I shouldn't say whether fortunately or not, but have seen the error of their ways and have moved back to where some of our newer evangelicals are, which is two wise men. That is the preacher and then the writer of the introduction and conclusion. Neither one of them being Solomon. Now Kidner and I forget who did the EBC on Ecclesiastes take the position that they see one author behind the whole production. An author speaking through the preacher, but we hear his voice in the introduction and conclusion. But it's not Solomon. It's not Solomon. And even Delitzsch and K and D could be added to that. It's just an anonymous wise man. And Delitzsch had the famous statement that has also been corrected in the last 150 years, but made the statement that if Ecclesiastes is not late, there is no history of the Hebrew language. And he tried to bring up all the Aramaisms that would not have come into Hebrew until the intertestamental period, and so of course he put it very, very late. In that which we look at as a very, very conservative Old Testament, commentary on Cain. And usually it is. But at this position, he took a much later date, again with the idea of an anonymous wise man, and Kidner and the Exposited Bible Commentary take that position as well. But probably the most prevalent position both in evangelicalism and liberalism today is position D. Most of the contemporary commentators, no matter what their theological persuasion is, based upon the text, say, well, the preacher, and Longman goes through the lengthy discussion on the fact that the second wise man is just putting the words of the preacher into the mouth of Solomon, a Solomonic-like wisdom. That's what the preacher is. He's not Solomon himself, but he's being portrayed as Solomonic-like by the second wise man who writes the introduction and conclusion. All right, so there's the issue of authorship. A bigger issue, obviously, well, not that doesn't have its own ramifications, and I think I made it clear where I stand. I mean, I would certainly see by the statement that is made the words of the preacher, the son of David. Vanity of vanity, says the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem. By the very words of 1:1 of Ecclesiastes, the preacher is Solomon. You have to take either position A or B. All right? If you want to go with Eaton and the fact, and certainly the text, we can't say positively or negatively whether the framer, we might put it that way, of the introduction, the conclusion, the framer of the book was Solomon himself. That battle probably will rage until we get to heaven. But certainly, in believing the inerrancy of Scripture, the preacher has to be Solomon. I mean, there is no other way to interpret the words that are given to us in 1:1. And certainly it could have been a later, when you say the preacher, the son of David, king in Jerusalem, realize son of can have the idea of a one in the line of David. And of course he had numbers of sons, grandsons, great-grandsons, etc., that were king in Jerusalem. But none, when you get to the end, that was considered a wise man like Solomon. As you go back, obviously, in the text of Kings, the one king who was viewed as wise, having a wisdom given from God, is Solomon. So you read 1:1, the preacher Solomon. So the author either has to be A or B. In the end, it could have been a second wise man who was the editor of Solomon, but who was wiser than Solomon to give the introduction and conclusion. And you can get in the literature where, again, outside of Israel and the other ancient Near Eastern points where wise men at times would, as it were, quote their own wisdom and give you an introduction and conclusion. So to say it's all Solomon is not missing the mark. But at least the preacher. If you deny the preacher is Solomon, I think you got a problem with biblical inerrancy. So I leave it at that. But what about the purpose? Garrett, I think, broadens this out, gives you about 7 or 8 purposes. So he starts to make a finer distinction. I just, in my reading, bring it down to 3. There are those who say the purpose is negative. The futility of human wisdom. This goes back to the old Scofield Reference Bible. This is the best the man under the sun can do. So that by and large, you read Ecclesiastes to read the rest of the Bible. All right, man left on his own under the sun, can't figure it out. That's where you end Ecclesiastes. So why should you master it? Well, it's a portend to the rest of Scripture. But chapter 12 says the preacher himself gave words of wisdom. All right, so if Job and Proverbs, I mean, you don't take that position. This is just to lead you to the negative position of the futility of human wisdom. So you'll turn to godly wisdom. It is the fact that the book itself claims to give godly wisdom. And not just in the prologue and epilogue. The preacher gave godly counsel, godly wisdom. Therefore, I have a hard time saying that the whole purpose of the book is just negative, to show the futility of human wisdom. Now, it does do that. And no one disputes that. And certainly, we just seen that within the conclusion. Hey, there's plenty of other books out there if you want to get human wisdom. But in the end, at the end of the day, there is a positive message. And Kaiser has been the strong proponent of this within evangelicalism. Kaiser basically took on we might put it this way, the Ecclesiastes gainsayers within evangelicalism. He was brought up on the Scofield study Bible, Scofield Reference Bible, and too bad he gave up some of the other things he learned from the Scofield Bible. But on this one, he had kind of a burr under his saddle and saying, no, the book of Ecclesiastes has a positive message. When all is said and done, it's a revelation of godly wisdom. And Provan takes that position as well. The majority position, as you can see, is that in the end, when all is said and done, particularly seen at the beginning and the end, particularly at the end, as the editor or the ultimate author gives his conclusion, it is all right, I showed you the futility of human wisdom so that you might respond to God's wisdom. That wisdom itself is used in 2 different ways within the book. So that in 1:13, I set my mind to seek and explore by wisdom concerning all that is done under heaven. All right, that wisdom is not a God-given wisdom. This is just, I am following the world's wisdom. I set myself as a man to find out about the world, and in the end, I found that was all vanity and a striving after wind. Because verse 18 of chapter 1, in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. Well, at this point, he can't be speaking about the knowledge that comes through wisdom, that knowledge which begins with the fear of the Lord, which is the beginning of wisdom, and the fact that the wise who fear the Lord will increase in knowledge. Here he's saying, look, to seek to devote my heart to wisdom, and the more I learn, the more I knew, the worse it was. Just increasing pain. And so within his own life, for a time, he gave up that pursuit and devoted himself to pleasure. And certainly when we see what he said experientially he did in chapter 2, obviously, that is very much like Solomon, who was involved in this great building programs and applying himself to all the pleasures that earth has to give. And in the end, that also, to 11, was vanity and striving after wind. And there was no profit under the sun. So I turned to consider wisdom, madness, and folly. And I saw that wisdom excels folly as light excels darkness. All right, as you then take a look at wisdom cannot convey all. Because the wisest man cannot learn all that God is and God has done and is doing. Even there is still, even with the wisest of men, they are not God. But it certainly is better to hear what the wise have to say. And now we're looking at those who truly have come to a measure of wisdom vis-a-vis the foolishness, the folly, the madness that most men devote their lives to. Certainly there is this taint within Ecclesiastes of man apart from God cannot get the picture. In fact, he falls into foolishness. And even a man with God can only come to a measure of wisdom. It is not complete and total, as even the wise man lives upon the earth. It's hard to choose between B and C. What I would say is when it comes to the book as a whole, and that's the way the book is to be read. Don't just take apart individual parts. But in the end, when all is said and done, what is the thrust of the book? And I have to say the thrust of the book is positive. It is godly wisdom. That's what it claims within the book itself. Now, within that, as you're going through it, to bring about that final positive end, obviously, there is an emphasis upon the futility that man experiences in this world. Now, that's just the realism. That's just reality in living in a fallen world. So to show you how I would see Ecclesiastes flowing, and I basically here do follow David Dorsey's approach and literary structure of the Old Testament. Reading the conclusion first. And Ecclesiastes is one book where that's a smart thing to do. Read what you're supposed to see and hear from the preacher, and then go back and find it in the preacher. I figure the preacher is the best interpreter of the preacher. It's kind of like, when Dr. MacArthur is finished with a message on Sunday morning and he got a few questions, the best thing to go is to go to the preacher and find out, what did you mean by what you were saying? And assuming that the preacher knew what he was trying to say, he is the best interpreter of what he said. All All right, so knowing that he says, all right, when all is said and done, fear God and keep his commandments. All right, where does he bring before us fear God? Well, we've already seen it in chapter 5, verses 1 to 7. His final word in verse 7 is, rather, fear God. Don't be applying yourself to try to get these dreams and words and meaning of words. Right? In the end, hold God in awe, submit to him. All right, if that is the center, if this is where, according to his own conclusion, this is what you are to hear, this is what you are to learn, what do we see? Well, we already know. We've got the title and the conclusion, where the author is mentioned in the third person. We have in chapter 1, verses 2 to 11, this poem about the brevity and seeming insignificance of life. He comes back to talk about the brevity of life beginning in 11:7. We've already looked at that through 12:8, where he starts to talk about the fact that, hey, enjoy life when you can because it's only going to slow down. As I said on Wednesday, cheer up, the worst is yet to come. Your worst days are in front of you, not behind you. Now, I know that goes against everything you're told. What do we always hear? Our best days are ahead of us. I think that the past is just a prelude to that which is even better. Well, in the life of an institution, that might be true. Hopefully, TMS's greatest days are still ahead of it. But I want to tell you, those involved in TMS, you and me, our worst days are in front of us individually. Because the process of decay is still before us. And I can tell you, gentlemen, your eyes don't last forever. Your hairs give out. You start to lose your hair, your vitality. Hey, what I could have done 20 years ago, I can't do it. Everyone told me, watch out for 50. Man, I went through 50 like it was a breeze. I got to tell you this. Take your vitamins, work out. Watch out for 55. Because I got to 55, and that was my wall. Boom. And all of a sudden, what I could do just a year or two before, energy-wise, just can't quite do as much anymore. So guys, burn the midnight oil while you're young. Because a day is going to come when the midnight oil is going to burn you. All right? Just this is reality. This is what you face up to. So he comes back, wisdom concerning the brevity of life. Basically what he's saying is, hey, do what you can do when you can do it. Because the day is coming when you can't. And wisdom can give guidance, despite its shortcomings. Even wisdom from a godly man is not complete and total because he's not God. And by the way, even if he could give all of God's wisdom, you can understand anyway because you live in a fallen world. So it's a modified wisdom. Of course, that goes back to, he's already seen in chapter 1, 12 to 226, setting yourself to wisdom, you will not penetrate and find wisdom in its totality. So in chapter 3, come to realize that you're a time-bound creature. And we have another poem about time in chapter 7, verses 1 to 14. Around that are the problems. All right, as you live upon the earth, you're going to run into these problems. Injustice, suffering, deprivation. The world is full of that. And generation to generation, it does not change. Why? Because we live in a fallen world that is inhabited by fallen men. And by the way, even though you're on your process, on the process, through your redemption of being changed, we many times are also part of the problem instead of being part of the solution. And the solution is not going to come. Now, there should be a measure of solution among, in the Old Testament, the righteous remnant, the godly, and in the New Testament era within the church. You should be able to come among God's people and say, now this is a different world. We don't treat each other the same way here. Romans 12:2, we're already living as though we're in the kingdom because we're being changed, transformed by the renewing of our minds. And now starting to prove, as we grow, what the will of God is. But you know, guys, you probably learned this. You can't spend 24 hours a day in church. You got to leave TMS and get on the freeway. And I wish that everybody on the freeway was sanctified, but they're not. I almost saw an accident today because truck ran a red light. That's the world you live in. And 2 years ago, I saw a fatal accident, where someone did nothing wrong. Now, the people who did the wrong died, but that person is maimed for life. And I'm just sitting there, having just done Ecclesiastes in class, saying, Lord, it's not fair. The person didn't do anything wrong. They weren't speeding. They were driving their car the way they're supposed to drive their car. Someone else wasn't. They paid the price. And I felt myself just like, Lord, don't you know there's seeming injustices within this world? I guess there are, because it's fallen. And Ecclesiastes hits that head on. And so in the heart of it is, fear God. God has put eternity here. We know that there's more than this. But leave that to God. And basically, there's no book in the Bible more than Ecclesiastes that says, in the end, let God be God and realize you're man. And as man, fear God, keep his commandments, and in the end, he will right the wrongs. Live by that wisdom. Well, in preaching Ecclesiastes, I got the same problem I've given you before. Ecclesiastes is best preached in one message. Because the problem is as you got to let people see the big picture. I mean, let's face it, you get into chapter 4, verses 1 to 6, the world is full of suffering and deprivation. Well, I guess it does relate. I mean, people are there saying, I see that oppression all the time. I see the suffering all over the place. But where's the answer? The answer is not within those verses. Right now you're seeing it. What's the answer? That's life in a fallen world. Fear God and keep his commandments. So, in other words, even if you do more than one message, you got to keep driving the people to the conclusion to see the context of what they are hearing. You can preach some passages in Ecclesiastes and you and the people can get very, very discouraged very, very quickly. And there should be some godly sorrow. There should be some godly discouragement. Again, maybe position C does have a little sense to say it there. Sense the futility of life so that you will throw yourself completely upon God. come to realize that man does not have the answer in and of himself. But you see, Ecclesiastes is more than that. You come to grips with it so that you might be able to live for God in this fallen world. You come in wisdom to understand and accept the world as being cursed because of your sin. And you finally face that reality and realize you can't do anything about that. All you can do is realize God has put you here. God has given you your life. You are to rejoice in your God and the work He has given you to do. You are to trust Him implicitly and follow His ways even when you do not understand why that commandment is for your benefit and for the benefit of the whole. And so Ecclesiastes. And since Ecclesiastes, of course, speaks so much about facing the reality of the world and, of course, its futility, its absurdity, well, it's very much to where the postmodern mind is. You know, we live in a world that we cannot figure out. But you see, the answer of the postmodern mind to that is self-actualization. If the world doesn't make any sense, make your own sense. I mean, don't let anybody be your judge. You just live your life the way you want it. Hey, if you want to wear a blue shirt, you know, with pink shorts, hey, that's your freedom. Don't let anybody tell you you're mismatched, wrong colors. Hey, see, that's what it all is today. I mean, all these crazy things that just don't match. You know, don't let anybody tell you. You create your own world. You create your own meaning. You create your own truth. You live life and don't let anybody else tell you how to live. The self-actualized individual, I mean, that's postmodern man. Well, that's baloney too. We've already talked about that. Yeah, you can wear, you know, two different kinds of clothes, and that most men do before they get married. as uncoordinated. When I was a college student, I wore what I wanted. Now I wear what my wife wants. And you know, she's got better eye for everything, you know, than I do. What got me into that? But I'm not a self-actualized person. I'm a wife-actualized person in some places. Because there's a harmony. Well, of course, you can wear mismatched clothes, and it's probably not going to get you a whole lot of trouble. We already talked about this. You can go up to the front and at the top of this building and say, I'm going to actualize myself. I don't believe in gravity. It's not my truth. You know, I want to live like Jonathan Livingston Seagull. I want to just get up here and flap my arms and away I go. And you know, there's an answer to Jonathan Bach and Jonathan Livingston Seagull. Splat. Because that will get you into trouble. Because just as there's a harmony of color, there's also the balance of gravity. What got me into this? I'm preaching Ecclesiastes to you right now. That's what's happening. Right? You face up to it. And accept the wisdom that has been given to you by the wise man. And the great thing about Ecclesiastes is it delivers you from every other book that is out there. I don't have to read Maslow. I don't have to read the Idiot's Guide to whatever is out there. I know I'm a dummy. Ecclesiastes has told me that foolishness has come because of sin. And now living in a world affected by sin. And so I face reality. I accept my life as being given to God. It's going to come to an end, and when it comes to an end, I'll face God. And so I will appreciate that, live by that wisdom. And so Ecclesiastes, does have, and it is, and becoming, and Kaiser brings this up, has probably become in the last 30 years the favorite book among college students in North America and Europe. Because it's like, here is a book that talks like a 21st century college professor. He's the preacher who convened his class and said, okay, now when you go back into the world, let me tell you what kind of a world it is. And the preacher gave his message. And in the center he put, fear God. And he concluded, fear God, keep his commandments. So it's a tremendous book of wisdom. And so don't skirt it somewhere within your ministry. Go ahead. At least give one message. At least let the people know what Ecclesiastes is all about. And of course, if you disagree with me, figure out what you think it's all about and give them that one message. Although prayerfully, hopefully, you will, what should I say, come to the same conclusion I did. Well, let's put it this way. Whatever conclusion you come to, you got someone who agrees with you. All right, but that's the way I would see it. And basically, that is the approach that is seen also in Ecclesiastes. By the way, about 5 years ago, 3 or 4 or 5 years ago now, Professor Stitzinger in chapel did Ecclesiastes in one message. Again, with the same context. You got to see the big picture of what Ecclesiastes is driving at. And I would commend that to you before you preach. Go down to the basement and for a couple of bucks make a tape of that message. 45 minutes. A message that preached Ecclesiastes. And it's not in print, sorry to say, but it's available downstairs in the library. Get a copy. And go and do likewise. After you've studied it, don't just parrot what Professor Stitzinger said. Come to the study and come to the same conclusion. And it was a great message, and a message that mirrors what was in the study Bible, and obviously mirrors the approach that I have taken toward the book as we have looked at it together. Here it is, the book of Lamentations. 3 of the chapters begin with the word how. How lonely sits the city. And of course, since the Hebrews were always looking for that first word or phrase to title their book, that's the title that came in the Masoretic tradition. How? And I think it is more of an exclamation point rather than a question. The author is not saying why, he is saying, oh, what has happened? Look at it. It is from the Talmud that this portion of the Old Testament was called Lamentations. Interestingly, it is in the Talmud also reflecting early rabbinic tradition that the Lamentations were tied into Jeremiah. It is very, very true. We'll come back and talk about this very quickly as far as an interpretive issue, but it is true that Lamentations as a text comes to us anonymously. There is no statement of authorship within the text itself. But the Talmud does say not only it was Lamentations, but as you can see reflected in the English title, the Lamentations of Jeremiah. The Septuagint and Vulgate just called it tears, crying, which obviously is also tied into lamenting. It is agreed that whoever the author was, and whenever he might have been writing this, certainly upon his mind was the destruction of Jerusalem. And of course, since Jerusalem and the temple was not destroyed again until AD 70, which on everyone's dating is too late, it is talking about the first destruction of Jerusalem in 586 BC. And it seems from the text itself that the author is himself viewing and reflecting upon that destruction. And so I would put, as you can see, much earlier, in other words, when the destruction takes place, and the lamentation is penned, rather than later on, and obviously someone reading the events and taking some other oral traditions and later on, 100, 200, 300 years later, writing this up as the Lamentations. In the Masoretic tradition, you read Ecclesiastes, you read of living in a fallen world, the reality of that. And of course, Lamentations more particularly deals with the reality of a righteous man living among the unrighteous in Israel and in Judah and what has taken place in the destruction of Jerusalem. With the megalith, the scrolls that were used in the feasts, then it comes between Ruth and Ecclesiastes. It comes between the harvest and tabernacles, because it historically remembers the destruction of Jerusalem in August of 586 BC, and then it was remembered year by year. Now, certainly, as you take a look at the contents, all right, certainly some very definite themes emerge. I've given you the verses for them. We see the pain of Yahweh's servant. In fact, we see him talking about the city personified in the first 11 verses of Lamentations 1. She weeps bitterly in the night. Her adversaries have become her masters. She has seen the nations enter her sanctuary. All her people groan seeking bread. And then the city is looked at in the third person, beginning with verse 12. And more than that, later on in chapter 1, the city is personified in the first person. Verse 18, I have rebelled. I have called my lovers. My spirit is greatly disturbed. And so having personified the city as her, toward the end of chapter 1, it becomes I. And we see within this the pain of Yahweh's servant. This is particularly emphasized in chapter 3, verse 1. I am the man who has seen affliction because of the rod of his, that is Yahweh's, wrath. So the city is grieved. So the author who is, as it were, one with the city, is afflicted and grieved as well. Yet throughout Lamentations, even though we see the lamenting of the author as he speaks for the city. He realizes that, okay, this is not the righteous suffering innocently. This is not a Job-like situation on why has God brought this to pass. It is very clear throughout the book that this judgment has come from Yahweh. Verse 5 of chapter 1, for Yahweh has caused her grief because of the multitude of her transgressions. The judgment has come from Yahweh. Verses 14 and 15. The yoke of my transgressions is bound by his hand, they are knit together. Why? The Lord has given me into the hands. Verse 15, the Lord has rejected all my strong men in my midst, etc. So the judgment has come from Yahweh. We have the anger of Yahweh. That is what has brought it into being. So we see in 112, look and see if there is any pain like my pain, which was severely dealt to me, which the Lord inflicted on the day of his fierce anger. Yahweh is righteous in what he has done. Yahweh is righteous, 118. For I have rebelled against his command. And yet the same Yahweh who is responsible for the judgments is the same Yahweh who is not only righteous, but is also compassionate. And so he refers to Yahweh's Hesed in 3:22. The Lord's loving kindness, the Lord's faithfulness to his promise, to his word, indeed never ceases. And his loving kindnesses, his loyalties never cease, for his compassions never fail. And so it's because of that he can ultimately throw himself upon Yahweh in chapter 5 with a hope of restoration. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen us. Yahweh is a compassionate God. He is a loyal God. He is a God who does remember and can be called to remember. And ultimately in 5:21, restore us to you, O Yahweh, that we may be restored. Renew our days as of old. So the pain, because of Yahweh's judgments, a result of the sin of Yahweh's people. Our fathers sinned and are no more. It is we who have borne their iniquities. He sees the fact that this is an outworking of Yahweh's judgment upon Judah because of the sin that has culminated within that generation, but as we've already seen, is the culmination of the father's sin before. And yet also, the arrogance of the enemy that God has used. The rod of his anger. Just again in chapter 1 at the very, very end. All my enemies have heard of my calamity. They are glad that you have done it. Oh, that you would bring the day which you have proclaimed, that they may become like me. Let all their wickedness come before you, and deal with them as you have dealt with me. For all my transgressions, for my groans are many, and my heart is faint. Well, we should be aware of this. This is the righteous prophet speaking. This is the righteous remnant of Judah that have received this pain, saying, yeah, look at the end. The enemy is gloating over me now. They're glad this all has taken place. Yahweh, may they lament in the future the same way I am. May you deal with them as you have dealt with me. Again, because you are a righteous God. So here are the basic themes, and it's quick, and you get into the commentaries on that of those who support Jeremiah's authorship, and they bring up, you go through and you see the same terminology, you see the same themes, obviously, in the book of Jeremiah. The pain of Yahweh's servant. Where do we see that more spelled out in the prophets than Jeremiah? The judgment that was coming from Yahweh because of Judah's sin. Where was that spelled out any more cogently than in Jeremiah? The sin of his people, the arrogance of the enemy, and yet, and even though, like Lamentations, it is a very small part of the total, yet it is there. A clinging to God and a recognition that he will, in the future, restore. So, by the very fact you have the same themes, you have the same terminology that is picked up in Jeremiah that is seen in the prophet Jeremiah. So the purpose, and again, there's no debate about this. Yahweh's servant, whoever he was, lamented Jerusalem's great destruction caused by her sin, and yet gave a statement of repentance with a hope of restoration. He not only laments as one of the righteous remnants, those who have survived the destruction, the onslaught, but he also speaks for that righteous remnant in repentance and faith in what God will do in the future. Now, the literary structure, and this didn't make it into your chart list, so here it is. It is amazing. This is brought up by commentators of the most liberal persuasion. And in fact, the closer to the events you see this being written, the more amazing is the structure. Because obviously, as you read the text, you recognize here is a man who is in deep emotional turmoil because of what has taken place. And let's face it, gentlemen, it's very, very hard for us to enter into that completely because, I guess 9/11 and all those images is as close as we can come. But I mean, realizing that here is, and particularly if this is Jeremiah, and I believe that it is, that here is a man who for over 40 years has lived in the environs of Jerusalem, has been involved in what has been taking place there, was born into a priestly family, has spent so much time within the temple, pleading with the people to repent and change, as we saw in Jeremiah, but let's face it, he hadn't known anything other than this glorious temple, the sacrifices taking place there, the offerings, the worship of God's people, Sabbath by Sabbath by Sabbath by Sabbath, though it was done many times and by most in hypocrisy. And even though he had been proclaiming judgment, the Babylonians were coming, surrender, but you won't, and this is what's going to take. I mean, just to see the stunningness of it taking place. And in Jewish tradition, Jeremiah on the Mount of Olives to the east, just looking at the complete and total destruction of both the temple and the city. And how he is so emotionally moved, and yet, in the midst of this tremendous grief, the fact that there is such a literary symmetry to the book. It's one of the most orderly books within the Old Testament. It's like your world has fallen apart, but the book is totally structured. The first 4 chapters in lament mode. The famous meter that is seen, limping 3-2, 3-2, 3-2. Even within the English translation, you can go through and see the first 4 chapters, you don't see this in the English translation, but are acrostic. And how you have in the first 2 chapters, 22 verses, obviously, with each verse beginning with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And how each one has the the poetic lines, 5 or 6 flowing out of it, and each line within this lament format. And then in chapter 3, how you have an increased acrostic, that is, every 3 verses begin with the next letter of the Hebrew alphabet. In fact, the New King James actually has it structured that way, dividing the 66 verses into 22 strophes, 22 verses, so you can realize there is a link, there is a key between each one of those first 6 lines, with every odd line, the first, the third, the fifth, beginning with the same letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And let's face it, any of you who have ever tried to alliterate a sermon, you know how it takes a little bit of time to get that kind of a structure. He comes back in chapter 4 with the same acrostic style that was in chapters 1 and 2 as he continues his lament. And then 5, he breaks out of it. There's no acrostic. There's just the 2 simple lines as you go through. Yet again, with those lines, he has 22 poetic parallelisms within chapter 5. Even though he doesn't now use the alphabet, he still uses that 22 numbered formula even in chapter 5, which gives this final poem. We've already said that chapters 1, 2, and 4 begin the same way. How? Chapter 3, which is the personalized chapter, the most personalized chapter of the book, I am the man. And then how chapter 5 begins was remember. Remember, O Lord, what has befallen to us. And now he gets into a prayer mode of asking for the Lord's restoration, as we have seen. You take a look at the content. The first lament is just a personification, a picture of the desolation of Jerusalem. The authors are saying first with the third person, then to the first person, gets you to feel a sense of the total devastation that has taken place of the city. A devastation that you see in chapter 5 that he prays would be overturned by Yahweh. In chapter 2, the lament is for the Lord's punishment of Jerusalem's sin. Then in chapter 3, the personal grief of the author expressed. Chapter 4, the Lord's wrath is detailed on his wrath and its expression. And then we get to chapter 5 with the prayer. And then, as brought up by many commentators, you can see a very definite link thematically. It's interesting, chapter 3 is the personal response of the author. Okay, I've tipped my hand by what you see there, who the author is. The response of Jeremiah that is in the midst of these 2 acrostic laments, to speak about the punishment that has come as an expression of God's wrath. And as we've already seen, chapter 1, as it speaks about the desolation, and therefore in chapter 5, the prayer for restoration, that the desolation might be overcome by Yahweh. And chapter 3, as we said, is where the author is himself speaking. In the first 2 chapters, the last 2 chapters, he speaks for Jerusalem. And he speaks for the godly remnants. He speaks for more than just himself. Now, I've already said bibliographically, after the structure, the bibliographically, brand new works just come out in the last couple of months by House on Lamentations and the Word Biblical Commentary. And then remember Harrison and Huey from from Jeremiah. And at this point, I can't point you to a good exposition of the book. I guess we're not lamenting people these days. Probably an interesting work based upon Lamentations is Francis Schaeffer's The Cry of the City that he wrote in the late 60s. But it's not exegetical by any stretch of the imagination. So still await a good expositional work on Lamentations. And Lamentations is a book that you could preach in one message, or obviously could preach in 5 messages. It certainly has the fivefold structure as we have seen. I've added, so write this in, selected interpretive problem, so we'll just hit one. Who wrote it? That's the number one issue as far as the book is concerned. There's not as much controversy about what's in the book as who's behind the book. And there are your 3 options. There is a debate upon whether one author is behind all of the book, particularly because chapter 3 is, okay, here's an individual and you've got the personification taking place before and after this. So you can realize that liberals in particular, I mean, when you can have more than one writer, that's what they always want to see. All right, so chapter 3 comes from one source, and at least the other chapters might come from another source. And of course, once you got 2 sources, you might as well have 3 and 4, and you know how liberals go. Only one author can use one word, and it's not creative enough to branch out beyond that. You'll learn all about that. You heard the weeping and gnashing of OTI, that the guys have, the students this year, Dr. Science, they have to learn all the critical theories and who holds them. And I've been hearing weeping and gnashing of teeth. I'm glad I get to teach you what the Bible has to say and not what the critics have to say, but you'll find out about that in OTI. So, and it's interesting that Ellison exposed Bible commentary. Now, he shows his conservative colors in chapter 3 is Jeremiah. But the rest is an anonymous group of writers, and he would see just a separate writer for the first 2 chapters, the last 2 chapters, and he does that internally, and yet says that certainly chapter 3 is from another source, another writer speaking in the first person. Again, you can't vary your style in the book. I mean, even an evangelical like Ellison says, well, from the text, it has to be a different author because chapter 3 is given in a different manner than the other 4 chapters. But at that point, he's one of the few evangelicals. Most evangelicals do not take C, and many liberals have even moved to B. It is a unit. There's just one author. And in the end, that's where House and Harrison end up. The book itself is anonymous. We can't tell who the one author is, even though there might be good biblical, canonical reasons for accepting that as being Jeremiah. In the end, both say, we'll just talk about the author. We won't say who the author is because the Bible is. And, all right, at that point, they're not denying inerrancy. The Bible doesn't say anywhere within the text, this is Jeremiah speaking. I think it's the best implication of what's in the text, but then we have to be careful. We can't say that House and Harrison at this point are doubting the biblical's authority, or even with House, even doubting the biblical inerrancy, because it's not an inerrant statement that is being defended in position 1. But certainly when you think in terms of, okay, you've got one author who implicit within what you are reading is an eyewitness of the destruction of Jerusalem, all right, who biblically qualifies for that within the canon, with terminology that is reflective of what is seen most within the canon of Jeremiah, that is the book of Jeremiah within the canon. It would seem, going along with Huey and whoever the author was in BKC and Kyle and Dalic. And Kyle was the more conservative of the two, of K and D. But Kyle's work on Lamentations, who better fits the bill than Jeremiah? And who has been associated with this book within Jewish tradition as far back as we can go? Jeremiah. So I think implicitly there is very good reason for holding this to be Jeremiah, particularly because the author is so predominant in the third chapter. Obviously, you do have to make some kind of statement as far as authorship is concerned. So I would go along with the classic position that if he sounds like Jeremiah, he speaks like Jeremiah, he sees what Jeremiah sees, I think there's a pretty good indication it is Jeremiah. Why doesn't Jeremiah give his name specifically? Because the Holy Spirit didn't lead him to do so. But more than that, it's not just Jeremiah. Jeremiah is speaking for the righteous remnant. It's not just Jeremiah saying, see how grieved I am by what is taking place. It is see by those who accepted God's message. And of course, this then has a continuing import, generation by generation. See as the righteous reflect upon what has taken place in the past. How they continue to be grieved about how God has had to deal with Israel's sin, knowing from the prophetic message that what has taken place in the past is a portent of what God is going to do in even greater judgment upon Israel's sin in the future. And the righteous remnant holding in faith, as you see at the end of Lamentations, to the fact that in the end God will remember and God will restore. Not just this historical situation, but you, O Lord, do rule forever. Your throne is from generation to generation. Jeremiah 5:19. It's the eternal God and what God is going to do to fulfill his promises in the future. So preaching Lamentations, I can't give you a model. Maybe I should tell Professor Sitsinger that next year in chapel we need a message on Lamentations. And he might say, good, preach it. So I might have to take my own advice. In a giving a model, but Lamentations, it is a reminder that God takes sin seriously. We've seen that within the prophets. What we see is in this lament, we might put it this way, the human realization of what the result of sin is. Total devastation, total destruction that took place historically. And so at least one message, and I have to admit, gentlemen, in all my years of pastoral ministry, I have never preached lamentation once. So, but you know what? I'm in fairly good company. It's not a lot of others who have either. So I can't say from personal experience, this is what you should do. All I can say is it is certainly a book worthy of at least one message sometime in your pastoral ministry. And who knows, maybe before you graduate, maybe someone on the faculty, even yours truly, might end up giving a chapel message on Lamentations.
How much background would you have to give on the book of Jeremiah? Or could you cut to this with enough data in like an introduction?
Well, of course, most commentaries on Lamentations have traditionally been bound with Jeremiah. Many of the commentators, not just Harrison, but many commentaries before that were Jeremiah and Lamentations. Of course, because obviously, even with those liberals who didn't hold to it, at least the tradition was there. I'm not so sure you have to deal with obviously you got to give a little bit of background. I don't think it's necessary for them to know, everything about what's in the book of Jeremiah. They just need to know what Jeremiah was, the prophet who God raised up the last 40 years before the destruction of Jerusalem. His message was one of repentance, or else God is going to bring this culminating judgment of Deuteronomy 28 upon you. There was a refusal to repent. Jeremiah shows that, and Jeremiah says, okay, judgment is coming. Now, the judgment he prophesied is the judgment that as a prophet now he sees, and this is his response to it. So here's the response of the weeping prophet to what had taken place in the destruction of Jerusalem, lamenting what had happened, and gives us, some idea of how we, as people of God, men and women of God during our own generation, that even though we also hold to the Word and know what the Word is going to say, even anticipating, from the book of Revelation, the great judgments that are going to come upon the world, nevertheless, when it happens, we're even stunned, and will be stunned when we return to this earth after the tribulation, stunned with how complete the destruction is. Jeremiah sees it, and here's his response in the book. All right, there you go, how they are. There's the introduction. All right, but I think that's all you need to get into the book of Jeremiah itself. Well, in the last few minutes, Daniel, the last book we will look at in the Old Testament. You don't have to worry, everybody calls it Daniel, after the main character of the book. And let me get where my sheet was. Let's do this. You've seen this. It's just for the video. The date of events. From the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, all the way through chapter 10, the 3rd year of Cyrus, king of Persia. Daniel gives chronological statements of when the visions take place, and obviously in chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 6, a statement of the years chronologically when these events take place. And so from his explicit statements, and a couple of times explicitly what is within the chapter, what happens in chapter 5, obviously the night in which the city of Babylon was captured by the Persians, etc. By looking and relating this to extra biblical statements in chapters 3 through 5, and then the explicit statements, we're able to say, all right, this is when these events took place. It is astounding with this chart to see, obviously, chapter 1, 605 BC, all the way through to the last vision in 536 BC, with chapter 6 taking place a year earlier, being thrown into the lions in about 537 BC. Now, take a look at the last chart. Daniel was around a long time. He was a young man when taken to Babylon. We'll estimate his age at right around 15, probably somewhere between 12 to 18 when he was taken to Babylon. Then we plot out the chronology within the book. Realize when he got thrown into the lion's den, he was 83 years old. That's why the lions didn't eat him. Even they had pity upon an old man thrown. No, I'm joking, of course. But realize, here's a man in his 80s taking this stand, throwing his windows open and praying toward Jerusalem. 1 Kings 9:15. following what Solomon had said. Realize why he was in retirement in chapter 5. I mean, here's a guy on Social Security. And seems implicit within the chapter that after Nebuchadnezzar, and he had been obviously a counselor to Nebuchadnezzar throughout his lengthy reign that came to an end in 563 BC, so that sometime, well, by the time he died, if he was 15, when Nebuchadnezzar died, Daniel would have been in his late 50s, around with our chronology we're using 57. All right, we get to heaven if it was a year or two earlier or later. But I mean, he was right at, in that day and age, I mean, by 60, you're an old man. So obviously when he was 80, he was a really old man. Now we'll have to just pick up the rest, the very beginning of Wednesday before we get into the interpretive issues. But just reflect upon that chart. If there's two kinds of people somehow today we think God can't use, it's the very young and the very old. It's interesting, we had not told anything about Daniel in his prime. 20 to about 50. Nothing. He was the counselor of Nebuchadnezzar. He was doing what he'd been trained to do. But it's interesting, during those years, no historical narrative, no vision that Daniel received. He stood for God faithfully as a teenager. So much for teenagers not, being able to do much for God. Remember Daniel. Oh, yeah, you get to about 60, 70 years of age. You're a senior citizen. Now, you can do one thing for God, pray. Well, Daniel came out of retirement and did more than pray. So I love Daniel. I love Daniel because he reminds us that God can use a teenager and God can use a senior citizen. You're not too young, you're not too old to be used of Yahweh. Great example of that, Daniel. A young man, an old man. Now, obviously, he lived a life of faith in between as well. I mean, that is the implicit recognition within the book. But in those early chapters, read about the young man and the young men through chapter 3. Then get toward the end of the book and read about old Daniel and what God did through him and how God continued to communicate his word to him. And by the way, I'm no liberal. Daniel wrote Daniel, I believe. So how old was Daniel when he wrote the book? In his mid-80s, at least. Which means, guys, hey, your best book might still be in front of you as far as writing is concerned. Who knows? Dr. MacArthur's greatest literary legacy might be 20 years off still. So keep preaching, keep teaching, be faithful till the end, like Daniel.